In the last 20 years, there's been a growing debate, a growing argumentative debate among Christians about whether or not women should hold roles as pastors, that they should be teachers in the churches, whether they should be silent in the church and not saying nothing. And they use this passage in First Timothy chapter 2 to kind of back up that statement. But I feel like they don't look at the history and the context of what this passage is talking about, and they form a theology just at face value of reading these couple of verses. So in this video, we're going to explore whether or not a woman should be teaching, pastoring, having some kind of authoritative role within the local body of believers. So stay tuned. I'll see you on the other side. First Timothy chapter 2 verse 8. I desire then that in every place the man should pray, lifting up hands without anger, her holy hands without anger and quarreling. Likewise, that your women should endure themselves in respectful apparel, in modesty, and self-control, not with braided hair, gold, or pearls, or costly attire, but with the proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self control. To fully understand what's going on in this passage, you have to understand the cultural context of what's going on at the time of the first century church in the city of Ephesus when Paul is writing to Timothy about these things. Ephesus is a city in Asia Minor in an area, a region called um I just lost my Artemis. Artemis. And then you had the false god Diana. And so in this particular city, you have a major port and commercial center in Asia Minor, Asia, Asia, Asia Minor, famous for the Temple of Artemis. And this is the city of Artemis, and it has the Temple of Artemis, and that's Diana, the false god. It's one of the major seven wonders of the ancient world, and you see this in Acts 19. This city, this area of the world at that time, it had three different characteristics. You had wealth and social status, religious confusion. So you had like pagan worship, black magic, witchcraft, occults. You had all kinds of choices when it comes to um, different religious affiliations. And then you had false teachers who were getting involved into the church. And you see this playing out in First Timothy chapter 1 and First Timothy or Second Timothy chapter 2. You see false teachers. In that culture, wealthy women often displayed status by having very fancy styles, gold and peers and expensive clothing. They showed off their rank and their status. And it was just the way that the culture was. So Paul comes in and says, hey, you're not representing the God that you claim you serve because you're supposed to be coming to God in humility, that you are nothing, but instead what you're doing is you're showing off your rank, you're showing off your status, your wealth, you're not dressing modestly, and Paul was targeting that culture at that time. Now, something important to point out is in verse 11, he says, let women learn quietly and with all submissiveness. This was a positive thing. Uh, in that culture, women were not allowed to learn anything. It was just kind of part of the culture. And even very recently, what, 50, 60, 70 years ago in the United States, you had the women's movement rise up, which is part of Bible prophecy, that in the last days, women will begin to rise up and demand that they have equal rights. And that is a Bible prophecy. So imagine 2,000 years ago, being able to hear from the Apostle Paul that it's okay for women to obtain the knowledge of the faith and to learn the faith, which became a very valuable asset in the church for a woman to learn the faith, because as you know, a lot of women in the church kind of carry out the church, especially today, as a lot of men no longer go to church. So it's a positive thing. It's helping the church push forward whenever men do not want to step up and do what they have been called to do, and that is to lead. Paul goes on. He talks about how Eve was deceived, how Eve became the transgressor. But down here in verse 15, he says she will be saved through childbearing. It's kind of weird because we're saved by grace through Jesus Christ dying on the cross. So is Paul saying that women can only be saved if they have kids? I don't think so. I think what Paul is saying is that they will be saved. They won't die. In that culture, in that time period, women died a lot when they had kids, and sometimes that happens today. And so this is kind of a promise that if a woman lives the faith in love and holiness, she will make it through that painful experience of childbearing. And I think that has to do more with like the spiritual state. I think there's some kind of promise going on with God and his people if they live according to the faith. This word self-control, it pops up, what, 2 times in this little passage? In that ancient day, in that city, in that area, women were adorned with fancy hairstyles and gold and different types of jewelry from their husbands or from their fathers, from family members. They were adorned with that because of the culture, that pagan culture that they were in. And so they boasted to all the other women that had less than them, that they had more than them. And Paul is saying you need to have some self-control and stop boasting about your wealth. Stop boasting about the fact that you might have something more than someone else. So what Paul is doing in this passage is not really telling women that you're second class citizens. He's lifting women up and saying, hey, you can learn the scriptures just like your husband can learn the scriptures. He's lifting women up to be equal. But at the same time, he's saying that worldly cultural stuff that y'all got going on out in the streets, when you come into the house of the Lord, leave it at the door. And that's essentially what Paul is saying. He's not saying that women cannot be in leadership roles in the local church. There are women throughout the book of Acts who are deacons and they are being used by God to spread the gospel and to reach people for Christ. Paul himself, he was a leather maker. It says in the Greek that he was a leather maker. Some scholars believe that he was a tent maker. Whether he was a leather maker or tent maker is debatable, but there was a couple that he was with, and he was among, and he of the couple that he was doing ministry with is the woman that was the most godliest in that couple. The woman was more connected to reaching people for Christ than the husband was. And in one of his letters, which I don't remember which one, if you know which letter that is, comment below. But in one of his letters, the Apostle Paul takes his time to honor that woman for her ministry. Yeah. So women absolutely can be in ministry. Absolutely. What you got going on in the Ephesus church is a cultural situation in that time period, in that day of age, where Paul was attacking the culture of the world and telling Christians essentially stop being lukewarm, stop having one foot in the world and one foot in the church. Be all in for Jesus or don't be all in for Jesus. And so that's what you got going on. And then Paul goes on right after he's done talking about the role of women in the church. He goes on to talk about the qualifications of overseers. And one qualification is that an overseer must be the husband of one wife. So an overseer, based on that one verse, is a man. An overseer is a pastor or a elder, and I did a video about that. And then he talks about deacons, the qualifications for deacons. Verse 8, chapter 3, First Timothy. Deacons likewise, being dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons. If they prove themselves blameless, their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderer, not but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their household well. For those who serve well as deacons gain good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. Deacons also must be the a man, the husband of one wife. Now there is a position that is not talked about right here. I believe it's talked about in the book of Acts, called, called deaconess, and that is the role of a woman who is a deaconess or a church leader that serves in the church. And I can go on and on about that too. But when we read scripture, we need to read it within the context of the culture it was written in. And we also need to read it within the context of the language it was written in. The Apostle Paul, before talking about overseers, he talks about women. And before he talks about deacons, he talks about overseers. The Apostle Paul thought it was very important that before he starts talking about the positions and the roles that men play in the church, he says, I'm going to talk about the positions and the roles that women play in the church. And there's a very important reason, because it's very important that a woman understands her role in the church. More important than for a man to understand his role in the church. And that's based on the fact that this was written in Greek. Anytime you see an order of anything, like right here, the first one is the most important. So Apostle Paul is like, I'm going to talk about the role of women in the church, and then I'm going to talk about the role of overseers, and then I'm going to talk about the role of deacons. And then after he's done talking about the roles of those three positions, the Apostle Paul goes on and he says, I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar, a buttress of truth. Great indeed, we confess, is a mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up into glory. The Apostle Paul wants to come to Timothy. He wants to come to Timothy in person and say something. But before he comes, he wants to send a letter over to Timothy and say, I've been hearing rumors about your church. And I need to tell y'all, you're not behaving the right way. And this is how you behave. This is the role that a woman plays. This is the role that the overseer plays. This is who qualifies as an overseer. And this is who qualifies as a deacon. This is the role that a deacon plays. Why does Paul not talk about deaconess in First Timothy? Because in that church, in that particular church, there was no women in that church qualified to be a deaconess. So that's another point I can point out, is that the fact that this church existed, even though there was a entire position within the church leadership function that was not filled. But eventually, once one of these women fulfills the qualifications of becoming a deaconess, then they would have some people fulfill that qualification, and eventually the Church of Ephesus would receive deaconess leadership in that church. So the Apostle Paul doesn't preach against women having authority in a church leadership structure. He preaches against women coming into the church with a worldly ideology and attitude when they come before God. But then he also preaches against man having a worldly ideology and attitude when they come before God, when he tells the overseers and the deacons, this is how you should be behaving. He puts a standard for both women and for men in the local body of believers.